So at any rate, we're going to be looking at the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th chapters of the book of Nehemiah. Okay, in the 11th chapter, it'll be speaking about the citizens and how that they determined who was going to live in Jerusalem and who was going to live perhaps on the outside of Jerusalem. And there was a very unique way in which that they did that. And then in the 12th chapter, we're going to be looking at the dedication of the wall. They dedicate the wall, and there's a big ceremony that takes place with that. And then in the 13th chapter, and this is going to be pretty interesting because it's how that the reforms and the reinstitution of the law was carried out. And if you've read ahead and read into the 13th chapter, you're going to find that Nehemiah gets a little bit strict, even to the extent of pulling hair, which is usually not typical for the Jews to do to somebody else. Usually it's to themselves, but most of the time when they're distraught, they will rent their garments. But we'll look into the reason why that Nehemiah had reacted in such a way. So at this point, they're going to be recruiting people to serve in Jerusalem, to live in Jerusalem. It's going to be a very unique way. They're going to have a certain percentage of people that are going to live in Jerusalem and another percentage on the outside in some of the cities. So for some of these people, it's going to amount to giving up some of their lands, some of their cities. What he does is he casts lots. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that took place. If it was the same as in Jonah's time, whenever that they cast lots to determine if Jonah was the guilty party causing the sea to be in a stormy situation, or how that they did this. But it was a way of determining, you're going to live here in Jerusalem, you're going to live here in Beersheba. So we're going to look at about the first verse, and I'm going to alleviate your anxiety about reading all these names that are going to be coming up, but we will try to point out who they were affiliated with. Some were of Judah, some were of Benjamin, and so on and so forth. So at the very first verse, we find that it's recorded in the 11th chapter, and the rulers of the people dwelt at Jerusalem. The rest of the people also cast lots to bring 1 of 10 to dwell in Jerusalem, the holy city, and 9 parts to dwell in the other areas or the other cities. So we find that they used this method, and it was kind of a fair method. It was left up in a way to providence, choosing who's going to live in Jerusalem, who's not, rather than Nehemiah having to make the choice and to say, you go to Jerusalem, you go out here, you go to Beersheba. It was just however that the dice was rolled, so to speak. And I don't know that they used dice, but at any rate, that's how that they determined where that they were going to live. And one authority says that there were probably about 4,000 to 8,000 in Jerusalem. Now, I'm not sure if that was the population before or the population at the time that they did this, but it was a very small number of them. And the reason why that they wanted to get Jerusalem inhabited, their enemies were going to probably be coming against them from the other countries. And the enemies don't usually attack people in the country. What they go for is the city. If they can get the city, they've got a strategic point. So now what they need to do is populate the city, get an army or a little bit better organization where that they can fight the battles that might be taking place. And so we find that this was the way that they divvied it up. And there were some that willingly, in the second verse, that were willing to voluntarily go and to live in Jerusalem. And they were blessed by the people that saw them go. They commended them for it. It was kind of a brave thing in that day and in that time to kind of give up everything and then just pull up roots and stakes, so to speak, and to go and to live in Jerusalem. So there was some sacrifice on the part of some of these people. Now at Jerusalem, there were the people of Judah that dwelt there, and the children of Benjamin. Now these people, what he is doing here, he's giving a recount of those that had come with Zerubbabel. You remember Zerubbabel in the very beginning? Whenever that he was the first one to exit Persia, and he took, I think it was about 50,000 or 40,000 with him. Well, this is kind of a rundown of the priests and also some of the tribes that were with Zerubbabel. And it gives the names, and I'm not going to go through all of these names. You can do that if you would like. And if you find the sources, you'll find that they do have some bearing in the history of Judah or in the history of Israel. In other words, they're not names pinned down and they were forgotten. Some of them have some great significance. In fact, I would recommend, if you find a good, reliable commentary, or you can look it up even in Google, it will help you to find if some of these people had connections in other parts of the Bible. And so this is what the 11th chapter is concerned with. We go down to the 21st verse of that same chapter, and it says that the Nethinims dwelt in Ophel and Zihah and Gispah over against the Nethinims. Now, the Nethinims were kind of like servants that were established, kind of an order of servants who did the menial tasks of the temple. You know, they would, sweep it out, shake out the carpets, things like that. But they dwelt in a very particular place in Jerusalem. The temple would be located kind of to the north, kind of close to where the sheep gate is. And that was done because when they brought the sacrificial sheep in through the sheep gate, the temple was there pretty close by. So the Nethinims dwelt kind of a little bit to the south of that in a place called Ophel. That was just more or less like a district. It would be like if you said the Nethinims were in the city of New York, but their dwelling place was in Brooklyn. It's kind of a situation like that. And they were there also close to the temple to take care of it. The porters and such also were allotted the spots and the places where that they were to serve. And then if you go over to the 25th down to the 36th verses of Scripture, it gives the names of the towns, like Beersheba, Adullam, Ziklag. Ziklag was actually pretty far over, close to the territory of where the Philistines used to dwell. And it's kind of interesting, that border of Judah would almost kind of expand, and we'll say a little bit more about it later, but you'll find some maps where it looks like it's real tiny, and here's Benjamin kind of in the middle of it, the tribe of Benjamin. And then other maps you'll find where that their borders had been expanded. So it was kind of like it fluctuated whenever that they made their divisions of the country. Now the 36th, like I said, the 25th through the 36th verses concern themselves with the cities that were surrounding Jerusalem. And the 36th verse, and of the Levites were divisions in Judah and Benjamin. In other words, they had their part in both cities, but they served, or both territories, but they served the temple. Now going into the 12th chapter, we're going to find that he numbers the Levites and the priests. And this is kind of significant from the standpoint of, remember when we were studying back earlier on in the chapter, that there had to be some sort of way that they qualified the priest and the Levites. In other words, is there a record that you're of this tribe of Aaron? Or is there a record that your father was a Levite? Because some of them had kept those records. They were very meticulous about that. And then there were some that lost it. And then there were some that probably thought, well, it'd be kind of neat to be a Levite whenever that they weren't. I don't know why, but they would. But that would have caused some big problems, because Nehemiah may not have known, Ezra may not have known, but God would have known. And we're going to see this, how that there was no pulling the wool over God's eyes with all of this. And there never has been when it comes to his worship. Now these are the priests and the Levites that went up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, and he was one of the priests that came from Persia. And it lists all of these priests, and where their background was. And I believe that the ones listed here were the ones that were bona fide, if you will, certified priests and Levites. Okay, they had the credentials to prove that they were worthy to work in the temple and to work in the service of God's temple. We'll skip on down because this gets rather burdensome trying to read all of these. But there's a couple of items we just want to bring to your attention. In the 22nd verse of the 12th chapter of Nehemiah, the Levites in the days of Eliashib. Now remember this name, Eliashib. Okay, he was a Levite or a priest, but do remember this name because it'll surprisingly crop up later on. The Levites in the days of Eliashib, Joiada, Joanna, Jaddua were recorded chief of the fathers, and also the priests to the reign of Darius. So they were around, going all the way back to being recognized during the rule of Darius the Persian, that made it possible for all of these exits from Persia to go to Jerusalem. He was the one that put the sanction on it and fulfilled what Cyrus had first started. And so all of these things we find he gives credentials to them, gives an account of how that they're connected to Ezra and the cities that they were going to occupy. Okay, we come to the 27th verse, and Nehemiah here is going to put it into play to dedicate the wall. Okay, the walls surrounding Jerusalem. Now this is just opinion, but I think there is a good reason why that those stones and those bricks and all of them were attention drawn to them. And we may preach on this later on, but it had to do with the fact they were preparing Jerusalem for the coming of Jesus Christ. Now, they may not have known it at the time, But there's a prophecy in Malachi that says, and the Lord of hosts shall suddenly come into his temple. And so Jerusalem was kind of like his temple. It was kind of like Christ's temple in a sense. Although he refers to the actual temple where sacrifices are made, all of Jerusalem was reconstructed and was built up just as close as they could to what it was originally. And so whenever that Christ comes along, everything is prepared for the purpose for which that he was to come. Now that's just opinion, but I believe that a lot of these things that we see with the reconstruction under Nehemiah, the gates, the temple, the law, the sacrifices, it's getting everything ready for Christ to come. Okay, and in the 27th verse, we're going to read just a little bit there. They dedicated the wall of Jerusalem, and they sought the Levites out in their places to bring them to Jerusalem. They were going to have a dedication ceremony. To keep the dedication with gladness, both with thanksgivings, with singing, and with cymbals, and psalteries, and harps. What king, former king of Israel, does this sound like? David, exactly. They were looking towards, in a way, in a sense, the restoration of the kingdom of David. Now, David's been dead and gone. You know, he's deceased. But they're going to have the son of David come into Jerusalem. So all of the dedication, the singing, the cymbals, the psalteries, I mean, it was quite a deal that they were going to do. David said over in one place, let us come into his courts with singing and into his courts with praise. Music was very important to David. You read those Psalms, you can almost put a melody to them in a way. You know, and I don't know that David had a melody, but I believe that these were to him songs. And we're going to find that whenever that they brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, you remember that where David danced before the Lord with all his might wearing a linen ephod? Those priests that had been used in the tabernacle services were kind of switched over to a different role. They were going to be singers. They were going to sing. They were going to give praises. So Jerusalem was going to be filled with music dedicated to God. So we find that the sons and the singers, 28th verse, gathered themselves together, both out of the plain country round about Jerusalem and the villages of Netophathiah, and also the house of Gilgal, out the fields of Geba and Asmaveth, for the singers had builded them villages round about. And the priests and the Levites purified themselves. They got ready for this. They were going to be coming into the presence of God. Ezra and Nehemiah had made an impression upon them that when they come before God, they were going to ceremonially cleanse themselves and purify themselves and get themselves coming into the presence of God. Now, it wasn't for the purpose of making them hygienically acceptable, but it was to show that I'm coming in before a pure God. As much as I can, I am going to come before Him with a pure heart. And that's what God looks for. That's what David prayed. Create in me a new heart, a pure heart, O Lord. And so they get themselves ready, they cleanse themselves, and we're going to find that they even cleanse the walls and the gates. Now, I'm not exactly sure, I couldn't find anything on it, how that they would do that. I would say probably they would do it about as close as what you would read previously in the previous centuries, how that they cleansed the items to go into the tabernacle. I would venture a guess. I don't have anything to base that on. But if you remember, in the tabernacle being cleansed, the things in it, they purified it and cleansed it with blood. Now, why would blood cleanse it? Because this one rule with God stands even true today. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins, and there is no cleansing, and there is no purifying. So I'm just guessing, and don't take my word for it. You might find something else. But at any rate, my idea on this was they would ceremonially cleanse it like they did with the tabernacle in the wilderness. He says in the 31st verse, I brought up the princes of Judah upon the wall and appointed 2 great companies of them that gave thanks, whereof one went to the right hand upon the wall towards the dung gate, and after them went Hoshea and half the princes of Judah. So they're standing on the wall. They're getting ready to celebrate all of this. So down in the 35th verse, and certain of the priest's sons with trumpets, namely Zechariah, the son of Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, the son of Mattaniah, the son of Micaiah, the son of Zachor, the son of Asaph. Okay, there's Asaph. That was the Levite that was set aside by David to be like a chief musician. We would say in this day and time, a minister of music. You know, that's about the best way that you could phrase it. And so at the fountain gate, in the 37th verse, was over against them, and they went up by the stairs of the city of David at the going up of the wall above the house of David. Now someone will say, well, I thought Bethlehem was really the city of David. Well, Bethlehem is referred to as the city of David. Its Hebrew name is house of bread. Christ is the living bread that came down from heaven. But this particular area in here, that what they call the city of David, the house of David, was actually an area in Jerusalem, and they think even to this day that David may be buried in what they call the house of David. So it was kind of fitting that it was to take place very close to it, and it was even close to what is referred to as the Watergate. Okay, and from that verse on down to the 40th verse, and we'll kind of move this along a little bit, but so stood 2 companies of them that gave thanks in the house of God, and I and half of the rulers with me. And they gave thanks. I don't know if they just said, thank you, Lord, continually, or how it was. But however that they did it, I believe with all my heart, they did it with thanksgiving, because all of this came down to this particular point where they dedicated. They had accomplished that God wanted them to do. I don't think it was by accident that Cyrus, all the way back in the days of Isaiah, was named as being the king that would help with the return of the children of Israel to Jerusalem. I don't think it was by accident. And you might say, well, Cyrus was a heathen king and he worshiped this God. But you know, God can use anything He chooses to do. And dare I to say to God, well, why did you use Cyrus, Lord? Why didn't you use Zechariah or somebody like that? You know, God uses whatever that He wants to use to accomplish His purpose. And it's a beautiful, gracious, powerful thing whenever that you read something like this and you see the fingerprint of God doing all of this. And someone will say today, does God still do things like that today? He most certainly does. It may be kind of hard to search out, but He does. I think he uses a means that we might be surprised at to accomplish his purpose and his will. So the companies gave thanks in the house of God, and it names from the 41st down through the 42nd some of the priests that were involved in that. And then the 43rd verse, also that day they offered great sacrifices, and they rejoiced. Now, it wasn't a drudgery for them. They were glad to do it. They were glad to bring the sheep or the goats or the bullocks or whatever that was needed for the sacrifice, and they rejoiced. God had made them to rejoice, and take note of this, and pay real close attention to this. For God made them to rejoice with great joy. I've got a feeling that every one of them was overcome by the joy that they felt in their heart for what they were doing. Why, what we're looking at is what we had only heard about. This is what David did. This is what Solomon did. This is what Aaron did back in the wilderness. And we're a part of this. And it was to give them, once again, that sense that they were God's chosen. And they still are God's chosen. They got that sense that they were God's chosen. And that God wanted to still use them. So we're going to turn over to, let's see. Okay, over just right before the 13th chapter, still in the 12th, and starting with the 45th verse. No, I'm going to go back up a little bit further than that. In the 44th verse, and at that time were some appointed over the chambers of the treasures for the offerings of the first fruits and for the tithes to be gathered into them out of the fields of the cities, the portions of the law for the priests and Levites. For Judah rejoiced for the priests and for the Levites that waited. And both the singers and the porters kept the ward of their God and the ward of the purification, according to the commandment of David and his son. There was a portion of it that was to be for the Levites, just as it was in the days of Moses, whenever that they were in the wilderness. Whenever that they would make the sacrifice, they would bring a portion of a meat sacrifice, and that was for the priests and the Levites. It was kind of for their subsistence, and that was what they were to live on. And you know, today, if you look at the map of what the territory was like when it was divided up under Joshua, you're not going to find a territory for Levi. Their inheritance was service unto God. And I would compare it to like, well, I'm not even sure there's anything today that you could compare it to. But you know, we have a service that God rewards us for. I believe with all my heart. And just like the Levites and the priests, there is a portion that we give for the ongoing of the gospel and for the perpetuation of the gospel. Down in the 46th verse, for in the days of David and Asaph of old, there were chief of the singers and songs and praise and thanksgiving unto God. And all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel, in the days of Nehemiah, gave portions of the singers and porters every day his portion, and they sanctified holy things unto the Levites, and the Levites sanctified them unto the children of Aaron. In other words, it was to be for all of them. And this came not as a commandment necessarily of the law of God, though the law of God did teach that, but the king of Persia commanded it. And isn't that something? You know, that God would move on his heart to give a commandment that they were to do this very thing that we're reading about. Now, going on into the 13th chapter, we're going to find that there are going to be some reforms. They've had time to lay the foundation of the temple. They have built the temple up. They have built the wall, the gates, and they're singing praise unto God. And so now there are going to be certain things that they are to do that might have been done before, but they're not going to do it again. And on that day they read in the book of Moses in the audience of the people. Therein was written, and the Ammonite and the Moabite should not come into the congregation of God forever. Because they met not the children of Israel with bread and with water, but they hired Balaam against them, that he should curse them. Howbeit our God turned the curse into a blessing. The Moabite and the Ammonite were not to be absolutely, under any circumstances, in the temple. Now we think today, well, we want people, even people from other countries, to come into our church. And that's right. Under grace, we do. But God, whenever that He was bringing the children of Israel up out of Egypt in the Exodus, there were very few times that He called upon them, to fight against this one or against that one. They fought against the Amalekites. But some of the other inhabitants of Canaan, they were not to fight against, because God was going to fight the battle for them. He was going to protect them. And He said, you don't take revenge on anybody unless I tell you to do so. So whenever that they come to this, they had mixed multitudes at this time. And mixed marriages. Now, not mixed marriages from the standpoint of race, but it was from the standpoint of these people around them that had kind of come into their presence over time. Were people that had worshipped Baal, they worshipped Ashtoreth, they worshipped Moloch, they worshipped Marduk, and some of these sacrifices and worship involved human sacrifice. Now, God never asked for human sacrifice except one. Now, there was a man in the book of Judges, yes, that took it upon himself to do it, but God didn't tell him to do it. That was Jephthah, by the way. But God never asked anybody to sacrifice his son. Well, what about Abraham? What about Abraham? This was show and tell unto Abraham of how that God would send His Son into the world, and He would not withhold Him as becoming the sacrifice that was needed to redeem us. That's why He said to Abraham, of your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. But at any rate, these people practiced this. They practiced some abominable stuff. I could go into detail about it, but it was things that God told them absolutely to not get involved with. But we're going to find out some did, but they weren't supposed to get access into the temple. They weren't going to go through again what they went through in the days of Solomon, where that Solomon, with some of the wives that he married, he brought their worship just right on into the house of God and even outside of the house of God. Okay, going on down a little bit further in the 3rd verse, it says, now it came to pass when they heard the law that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude. Now I want to add something to this today, because at a certain point we're probably going to be teaching on the book of Ruth. And undoubtedly the question is going to come up, well now wait a minute, Ruth was a Moabite. But Ruth said to her mother-in-law, your God will be my God. She completely forsook what she had been brought up in to embrace the Lord God Jehovah. And I believe that would be an exception. That was the exception to this, unless they completely forsook their idolatry and their worship, they were not to come in to the temple at all. And before this, going on down to the 4th verse, and before this, Eliashib, okay, here's where that it comes in. And before this, Eliashib, the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied unto of all people, Tobiah, the Ammonite, who had mocked Nehemiah, and who had said, why, that wall is so weak that if a fox should come up against it, he would knock it over. And get this, he had prepared for him a great chamber, whereof aforetime he had laid the meat offerings. He took the meat offerings that were dedicated to God, and the frankincense, and the vessels, and the tithes of the corn, the new wine, and the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites, and the singers, and the porters, and of the offerings. Now at this time Nehemiah was outside of Jerusalem. He had gone back to attend to some things in Persia. In the 6th verse, but in all this time was not I at Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I unto the king, and after certain days I obtained leave from the king. Now it's not really established how long that Nehemiah was gone. Some people think that he was gone for months. Some think that he was gone from Jerusalem for about 10 years. But anyway, we're going to see that it was enough time for them to slip back into their old ways. And it grieved me sore. Well, let me go back. When I came to Jerusalem and understood of the evil that Eliashib did for Tobiah in preparing him a chamber in the courts of the house of God, and it grieved me sore. Now, this is a pretty mild statement compared to what Nehemiah did later. It grieved me sore. I can almost picture this. It's almost comical in a way. It says, it grieved me sore, and I commanded they cleanse those chambers. You boys, you clean that up, where that heathen has been. And thither brought I again the vessels of the house. Oh, wait a minute. Let me back up for a second. It grieved me sore. Therefore, I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. I would love to have been a little mouse watching that.
It's almost when Jesus came in and turned over the tables.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
They were defying God's people.
Exactly. That was a defilement. Now, somebody would look at it and say, well, he was being charitable. God told him not to allow him in there, period. Charity or no charity.
And he was in there because there was a marriage.
Yes.
Father-in-law to...
Yeah, he was father-in-law to Tobiah. Right. I can't find the exact phrasing of it, but there's a phrasing in Nehemiah that talks about, and Tobiah took for a wife somebody who was related to Eliashib, and vice versa. So they were almost kind of like doubly related to one another. So Eliashib probably, I don't know, felt maybe an obligation. Who knows? But God comes before this, and allowing Tobiah to take up residency there. And like I said, I would have loved to have been a fly on the stone wall watching all this.
Careful with these.
Oh no. I could almost see maybe at the door, here comes a chair out. Here comes a table out. And here's Tobiah like, what are you doing with my stuff? You don't belong in here.
Nehemiah's probably hoping it all breaks.
Yeah. He threw it all out. He did. He didn't spare it. And you know, that was the zeal that Nehemiah, you know, that was God's house. That was God's house. It was dedicated unto God. It's just like this is our church. You know, it's dedicated unto God. We're not going to put a Bud Light sign up out here and you know, and say, well, you know, at intermission, you know, we got a tap in there. No. And I don't care how many, huh?
Or a gambling hall.
Yeah. You know, spin the dial or whatever, roll the dice. Wouldn't be casting lots, it'd be rolling dice. But it would be kind of the same thing in a way, the same principle. God's house is dedicated to the worship of Him. And everything that is done under the auspices that we're doing this for the kingdom of God. You know, whenever that we have fellowship is found in the Bible. Did you know that? Fellowship with one another is found in the Bible. And I said it before and I'll say it again. I commend you for the fellowship that you all have. That's scriptural. We're family. Just as much as they were family one to another. You know, those tribes might bicker and fuss with one another. But I'll tell you, whenever the Philistines set foot on one of those tribes' lands, boy, they all came and they defended one another. So anyway, Tobiah lost his residence. I just feel so sorry for him. And so anyway, all of his stuff is thrown out. And he said, I commanded, and this is in the 9th verse, I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers, and thither brought I again the vessels into the house with the meat offering and the frankincense, and that's where it belonged. And that was the purpose, that chamber was there in the temple. And I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, for the Levites and the singers that did the work, they were having to sustain themselves out in the fields and forgetting the house of God. Probably they were giving it to Tobiah, who knows. But anyway, he says, I contended with the rulers, and I said, boy, this is where it starts with Nehemiah. Why is the house of God forsaken? Boy, I leave you for just a little bit, and you're already starting to slip into what your forefathers did with idolatry and all of this. Kind of reminds me of when Moses went up to the mount to receive the law. And he came back down and the people were just, you know, they were lewd and they were dancing before this calf. You know, and whenever that he asked the question, where in the world did this come from? I love Aaron's excuse. Well, I threw some gold rings in there and I couldn't help it. This calf came out. Boy, oh boy, I'd like to have seen that too. You know what he did with that calf? He ground it up and he made him drink it.
Drink it, yes. Made it what?
He made him drink it.
Put it in the water.
He put it in the water and made him drink it. You want a calf? I'll give you a calf.
He ran that calf down there.
But anyway, he said, then brought all of Judah the tithe of the corn and the new wine and the oil. They started getting things back in order. And I made the treasures over the treasuries, Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and of the Levites, Pedaiah. And Pedaiah was somehow connected with the king back in Persia. And the next to them was Hanan, the son of Zachor, the son of Mattathiah. And they were counted faithful, and their office was to distribute under their brethren. Remember me. Now you'll see this with Nehemiah several times. Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and wipe not out my good deeds or my kindnesses that I have done for the house of my God and for the offices thereof. And in those days saw I in Judah some treading wine presses. Okay, he goes on to the next problem. In those days, I saw in Judah some wine presses, treading wine presses on the Sabbath day, and bringing in sheaves and lading asses, as also wine and grapes and figs, all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold the victuals. What did he tell them that they were to do? No manner of work on Sunday, or on their Sabbath day, which was different than our Sunday. But anyway, it was their holy day. Absolutely not. When he came back, that's what they were doing. There dwelt men of Tyre, and Tyre was a seaport and a fishing port on the coast. The men of Tyre, there dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem. Then I contended with the nobles of Judah, and said unto them, What evil thing is this that ye do, and profane the Sabbath? Did not your fathers? Didn't we go over this in the law that was read to you? Didn't we go over this? Did not your fathers thus, and did not our God bring all this evil upon us, our forefathers, and upon this city? Yet you bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. Now, it's one thing that they did it way back when, and went into captivity. Here we come out of captivity, we're trying to reestablish the law. And you're going to get us in trouble with God once again. And what will happen may not be very nice, like going into captivity. And it came to pass that when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath, I commanded that the gates should be shut, and charged them that they be not opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants said at the gates that there should be no burden on the Sabbath day. Well, here's what the merchants did. So the merchants and sellers of all kinds of ware lodged without Jerusalem once or twice. And then I testified against them, and said unto them, Why lodge ye about the wall? If ye do so again, I'll lay my hands on you. And from that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath day. They were staying outside the gates, and they were going to, I know so-and-so, maybe Eliashib, he let Tobias sleep in the temple. Maybe he'll open the gates before the Sabbath is over with. Nehemiah said, if I get my hands on you once again, it's not going to be pretty. And so it sounds like they took him at what he said. It said they came forth, from that time forth came they no more on the Sabbath. And I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves, and that they should come and keep the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Now once again, Nehemiah prays. He says, Remember me, O my Lord God, concerning this, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. He was kind of taking responsibility upon himself. Even though the people did it, and they knew better, yet he felt responsible. Now he comes to the next problem. In those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod. Ashdod was kind of over in the area of the Philistines. Of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. Now, it was important for them to understand and to be able to read and to speak and hear and understand in Hebrew, because the law was written in Hebrew. And he was asking, why aren't you teaching them the language of God in your homes, but you're teaching them the language of Ashdod. You're teaching them the language of the Ammonites and the Moabites, but you're not teaching them our language whereby that we read the law. You know, it's a tragedy to think about something like this. But you know, I fear whenever the children know more about other religions than they know about our faith in God. And there's a very, very striking similarity there. And I'm not talking about your children. I'm talking about children in general. And I can remember, and here I go, I can remember a time whenever the people that weren't even church-going people had a respect and talked to their children about God. So he said that I contended with them. Boy, he gets extreme here. I don't know whether to read this or not, but on the 25th verse, he said, I contended with them, and I cursed them, and I smote certain of them, and I plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your son for yourselves. It'd be pretty bad if preachers started pulling people's hair out. I'm glad that this is back in the Old Testament.
That'd get their attention, though.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it would. It really would. It most certainly would. But that's how zealous that Nehemiah was. You know, he said, you are going to bring God's wrath upon us. And I guess he had to do it to get their attention that, you know, look, brethren, I'm serious. Yeah.
Did he do it when he first got there? And when he was gone, they went right back in?
Yeah. It's almost like for whatever period he was gone.
He must have been gone a long time.
Well, that's what one authority says that's read this.
But that wouldn't just take place overnight.
Oh, no. No, it would be over time.
Yes.
Yeah, it would be over time. And actually, when you think about it, a lot less time than it took for Israel and Judah to get into this very same thing. Israel and Judah got into this very same thing, but it was over a period of maybe a century or two, with wicked kings, idolatrous kings, Ahab, Jezebel, so on and so forth. It was quite a little downward slope. But here, you know, they had barely gotten out of Persia. And here they were going back into what had sent them into captivity to begin with. So Nehemiah got pretty upset. Not just a little upset, but very upset. And so in the 26th verse, he reminds him, he said, Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. Now that word outlandish has to do with their religious practices that they would indulge in. Shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to transgress against our God in marrying strange wives? Now once again, I'm going to reiterate this. It wasn't a racial thing. It wasn't a superiority over you. It was because of their faith in God. And Satan continually tries to corrupt the faith of God. He tries to discredit God before his people, and he tries to accuse his people before God. And it says that one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Elishab, the high priest, who was son-in-law, here we go again. I just wonder if he kept his hair. You know, Elishab, who was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite, therefore I chased him from me. You know, the extreme, there's a saying, extreme measures or extreme things call for extreme measures. You know, he had to have had patience, but I think this was the last straw. Remember them, O God, for they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. And thus I cleansed them from all strangers and appointed the wards of the priests and of the Levites, everyone in his business. And for the wood offering at times appointed, and for the first fruits. Now Nehemiah ends it all by saying, remember me, O my God, for good. I would venture a guess that Nehemiah got the job done and pretty much laid out for them that God was serious about this thing and they were not to make alliances with other countries, with marriages outside of their religion. He pretty well told them. Okay, we're going to look at some discussion questions here, starting back in the 11th chapter. Okay, where did the rulers of the people live? Okay, in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was going to become the center of their worship. Okay, how was it determined where they lived? Yeah, cast lots, right. 1/10 would live in the city, the other 90% would live in the cities outside. Yeah.
I guess I missed something, but what is casting lots besides throwing the dice?
Yeah.
Stones?
I think they're stones somehow. They're on the bases.
Yes.
Yeah, different shaped stones. Okay. I've never really understood that.
And I've never been able to read, I don't think anybody knows how it was determined.
Yeah. Yeah.
They just knew they catch lots.
Well, you remember in Esther how that their religious priest would continually cast lots to try to determine not just the will of the gods, but how the whole year was going to go.
I read too where they broke branches in different sizes. And they would judge by the size
Yeah.
of the branch you could,
Yeah.
like drawing straws.
Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't a game of chance necessarily, but that's about the closest you could come to it.
Why did they have to do that? Why didn't people just volunteer to live in Jerusalem?
People are the same today as they were. You don't have
Well,
many out there pick me.
Yeah, well, some of them had already established themselves in the countryside and some of the cities outside. And then this has been brought up that whenever that they inhabit a city the size of Jerusalem, they're a target. And they're kind of, okay, we're okay now, but what if so-and-so attacks us and besieges the city? And we're going to find later that does happen under the Roman rule.
So
They do the
hide
same.
in the villages easier?
Yeah, so they could take off and go. They see they see a cavalry coming, they can take off. And the cavalry, the nation that's attacking them, not concerned with these little places out here. They want the prize. They want Jerusalem. I'm sorry, Marilyn, go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. It was back when they were asking what the casting box was.
Yeah.
It'd be like us tossing a coin
Yeah,
or drawing for the longest straw.
right, exactly. It was a way of determining who was to go into the city and who wasn't. Okay, there was a proportion of them that would live in the city, and then a proportion of them that would live outside of Jerusalem. Okay, what part lived in Jerusalem?
1/10.
1/10. Okay. In chapter 12 and verse 1, we find that they give kind of a outline or kind of a roll call, a roster of mostly the Levites and also the priests. Okay, and the priests and Levites in the roster that returned to Jerusalem, and I may not have touched on this, but it's in the first verse. They returned with whom? They came back with whom? Zerubbabel. Right. That was the first, I don't want to say Exodus, but it was the first group that came back. Okay. The restoration of sacrifices and the temple worship caused the people to feel what? Anger, great sadness, or rejoice with great joy? Exactly. Whenever that they saw that, whenever that they realized that, hey, this is what our ancestors did, here we are worshiping the same God, it caused them to rejoice. And you know something, when you come in on Sunday and you pray and you worship, you're worshiping the same God. Same one. He hasn't changed. Okay. What did Nehemiah do about Tobiah?
Don't you know he was a man?
I bet he went to his in-law, who was high priest, and said, I'm not going to be treated like this. Okay, yeah, Nehemiah threw his things out, and again, I could almost see a picture outside his door of here goes a chair, here goes a sofa, here goes a big screen TV, the whole bit. He just cleaned house, and he cleansed it too. That was another thing. He cleansed.
He wasn't of the Jewish lineage, right?
No, the Ammonites weren't. They were of the general category that you could say Canaanites, and then Ammonites would be like a subcategory of them. It's like saying the United States, and here in the middle is Missouri. Maybe I shouldn't compare you to Ammonites. Kansas. We'll pick on Kansas. We'll say Kansas.
Especially after he told them to separate. And here he's right in the temple with them.
This is the ironic thing about it. They go right back into what they just came out of.
And it didn't take that long.
No, that's the greater mystery about it. No, you can understand a nation that it takes maybe 100, 200 years, and they hit the skids like what happened with the last king, Zedekiah, I believe. I'm not sure. Last king who was taken into captivity. It took a long time to get to that point to where that they were overrun. But here they are 10 years.
But is it the same as a Christian?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
but this is the same people he talked to before.
Right.
It's
Well,
not a new generation.
no, exactly. It wasn't like they didn't know. I'm sorry.
It shows the importance of a Christian leader, of a godly leader.
Right.
If you don't have a godly leader,
Right.
then people.
Yeah, exactly. If he's not leading if he's not there to lead by example or by reading the Word of God, then it can happen. It's still as forceful as Nehemiah was. I'm surprised that they did what they did. But okay, what was Nehemiah's prayer? This is in the 13th chapter and 14th verse. Right. Exactly. And he prayed this several times, didn't he? Yeah, remember me, Lord. Remember me, Lord. He had such a great reverence. He had such a great, I don't want to say fear like we think of fear normally, but he was in awe of God, that God used him. I mean, think about it. He went all the way from the palace of Artaxerxes and got favor to do all this stuff, to rebuild it. And so he's asking God to just remember him, what he tried to do. Okay. How did Nehemiah stop the buying and selling on the Sabbath? A, moved the merchants outside the gates. B, shut the gates. C, donated the wine and figs to the Levites. D, gave food cards for Saturday. That really isn't on there. Okay. Exactly. Too bad. It's a Sabbath. You kind of see a type of this among some of the Orthodox Jews, and I would say in the area of Brooklyn, the Bronx, where there's a huge population of, if they've got a business, man, they close it down. And their Sabbath is from Friday evening to Saturday evening. From the evening to the evening. And too bad. You want to buy bagels, you wait until that it's over with.
I worked for a Jewish doctor, and it wasn't just for the people. The women did all their cooking for all the time, because once the evening came and the Sabbath began, they couldn't do anything. Right.
They had to even, and you can see examples of this today. It's kind of a glimpse back to this time. Even to the extent that they had to very carefully examine, will turning a light switch on be worked? I'm thinking of where that they filmed a ceremony of the Sabbath, and they had the lights on in all the house because they couldn't go and switch the lights on. Somehow that they determined that was work. They were very meticulous about that.
But they were trying on the letter of the law on the Sabbath here, too, that they weren't the ones selling. It didn't say they couldn't buy.
Right.
You and I talked about that.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, we talked about that they got to the point where they were really pushing.
Right.
And Nehemiah didn't care whether you were buying or selling. He closed the gates.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, you can see an example of that from what I'm told and what I've read, that the Pharisees were real sticklers about the Sabbath day. But they defined what their home was by what their belongings were. Like if you had this item or a chair or whatever, that was kind of considered your home. Well, if they wanted to move someplace, they couldn't do it on the Sabbath. So what they would do, they'd hire a Gentile, and they'd hire him to move it a Sabbath day's journey. And a Sabbath day's journey was so far. So the Gentile that was going to hell anyway, he carried it, just about that distance. And then here come the Pharisee, and then he'd say, okay, go about another so many yards. And okay, once again, Gentile would carry it. And that's how they got from point A to point B without breaking the Sabbath. Yeah, they were real sticklers about that. And there were even laws written about what was considered work, what was considered working on the Sabbath. Ceremonial cleansing of the hands. Now, I'll hush up here in just a second, but ceremonial cleansing of the hands always involved kind of washing the hands. And the Pharisees were real rigid about this, because they would go out into the street and they were afraid they're going to brush up against the sinner. So they would come back and they would wash their hands ceremonially. Well, they got into this big discussion one time. You find it in some of the writings, like, okay, what is considered the hand? Is it to hear? Or is it down to here? If it's down to here, we've been doing it wrong all this time. Well, maybe it's up to here. And they would argue this back and forth, you know. And no wonder Jesus said in one place, you strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. You ever heard that phrase? That comes from the Lord. He said, you'll tithe, anus, and mint, human, but you forget the weightier parts of the law, like justice, mercy, and love. It'd almost be comical if it wasn't so sad, you know. But at any rate, I'd say that Nehemiah really lowered the law on them and told them this was the way that it was going to be. We're going to get back to the worship of Jehovah, and these nations out here can do whatever they want to. Now, this is the last history that we have of them. Now, whenever that time goes on and the Lord comes, things are different. You have synagogues. You have an order called Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots. Kind of like, they were people that were kind of like the Proud Boys. They wanted to overthrow the government, which was Rome at that time. You have all these things going on. And you have the Romans. And it's all going to work together. It's all going to come together and work together. And the finality of it is that Christ would offer the final sacrifice that was needed to redeem us from sin. So I've enjoyed teaching this, and I hope you've gotten something out of it. And I'm not exactly sure where we'll go. Does anyone have a particular study that you want to do? And I'll have Shirley do it. No, just teasing. A particular study.
That's really what starts Christ.
Okay. Everybody be okay with studying Ruth? Okay, here's gonna be an irony. Ruth's a Moabite. But you read over in Matthew, I think it's Matthew, and she's in the lineage of Christ. Talk about inclusive.